Okay, and we are live. Okay, second.
Benedicite, Father.
Benedicite. Well, this is Deacon Joseph Suaiden. Hieromonk Enoch is here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can't talk very loud because my lungs are recovering.
Oh, okay. No problem. Well, today's show we were aiming for was going to be a little bit interesting because well, first off, it seems that right before we opened the show, there were a whole bunch of topics that opened up on the Orthodox Apologetics War and War Zone. So if you're on that, fun discussion there, lots of different stuff. We'll cover some of that hopefully in the latter half of the show. But in any case, I wanted to get into some of the stuff that even though I said I wasn't going to talk about myself, and I'm not going to talk about myself, there have been questions about whether or not certain types of people can be admitted to the clergy, who can be admitted, so on and so forth. And I think that the best thing to do in this scenario is to really kind of cover what the fathers teach on this, what the church's tradition is on this, and then we can move forward. Because ultimately, when you're talking about when we talk about the qualities that are required of clergy, ultimately we are in a very unique society today, but in some ways it's not that unique. It's just that we have a, I want to say we have a misunderstanding of where we are in history, if that makes sense, Father.
Yeah, okay, good.
And what I mean by that is we tend to think of the environment that we live in as Christian or as kind of semi-Christian or devolving Christian. And the truth of the matter is we're not. We're in what is almost a completely paganized society where Christians are effectively in the minority. And this is not something that I'm going to talk about politically or anything like that. But what I mean by that is that socially, the social aspect of Christianity is something completely and totally alienated from the reality of today's life. As I described earlier today to one of the kids, we're the bad guys right now. And in that sense, that gives us the freedom to speak clearly on certain matters, whereas we couldn't do that before. I know that's going to sound odd. But so just to cut to the chase, a random troll accused me of basically not being eligible to be a deacon because I was twice married. Besides getting into the clarifications of what we mean by twice married, we'll just define the proper way. The proper way it's determined, and that is a person who is married twice after baptism. That would be known as a digamist, as opposed to a bigamist. These are two different terms. A bigamist being someone who is twice married after baptism. A bigamist being someone who has two wives.
So when a polygamist, what would be a polygamist? How would that fit in there?
A polygamist would be somebody who has more than one wife. So a bigamist would fit within a polygamist, but a polygamist can have more than two wives. You can have three.
Oh, okay.
Fine. But the point is, a digamist is somebody who's been married twice. So they're two different things. And this is something important to understand in the history of the discussion. But the reason I want to bring this up also, not just because of a troll or because of my ordination, is because one of the things that is commonly said when we're dealing with Roman Catholic apologists is that in some way, shape, or form, the Orthodox position is succumbing to an earthly worldview, whereas the Roman position is really Christ's position, and that this single marriage, that there's no space for divorce, that everything can only be dealt with by annulment, so on and so forth, that this is the only Christian view that really existed, and that the Orthodox position is in some way, shape, or form fallen. So I'm going to address the question of divorce and remarriage from the perspective of the Codex Justinianus, or the Code of Justinian.
Are these the novella of Justinian or the Institutes?
I should, yeah. Well, the novella, basically, just to clarify, for those who don't know, the Codex of Justinian was first formed in Justinian's time. He felt the need to reform the code. The novella developed throughout his life as he kept on issuing clarifications. So, in other words, the novella are kind of like laws on top of laws, and then eventually so everything that's in the Code of Justinian is in the novellas, but in an expanded form.
Yes, and these were part of Roman law. They would have been part of the law of all the Christian people that would have existed within the Roman Empire.
And they also were, importantly, part of the law of Western jurisprudence. Time immemorial. They formed the basis of what would later become the common law. So on
all laws and technically all laws in the Mediterranean. I mean, Greece had the same. The Code of Justinian was in fact part of the Greek law code until they made reforms in the 20th century.
Yeah, and so what's interesting, and this blew my mind, is that the English translation that I'm citing from was actually done from the Latin by an American circuit court judge. I guess he just realized that the Code of Justinian had never been translated, so he decided he was going to translate the whole thing.
There's, in fact, another translation of the novella, too. There are two translations.
Yeah. I like this one, though, because it does, I mean, I hate to say it, but lawyers are one of the few classes left in the U.S. that actually use Latin, so they're generally pretty good with precision.
But they had Greek they had Greek editions of these novella also.
That's true.
Yes, okay.
But in any case, don't worry, we're not going to whip out the Greek or Latin until we start talking about certain fathers after we talk about the novella yet. But I want to give you an idea, and so I'm going to be reading from the novella, from novella 22 of the Code of Justinian, because I want you to have an understanding of how the state saw marriage, how the state saw marriages and divorces.
How the Orthodox state and the Orthodox...
the Orthodox Christian state in the 6th century. So when you're talking about, you hear like some Roman Catholics say, oh, well, that wasn't the way the Christians did it early. That's just a lie, okay? We're just going to read through it, so I'm not going to even, put in my commentary until I just get to, tired. All right, so let's let me see here where we can start. If I go all the way to the beginning, all right, I'm going to start with the preface because.
Can you put the link to the novella in the chat?
Absolutely. This is novella 22, so I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. Give me a second, and so let's see here. So I'm going to just read from that. And let's get back to it. Where did we put it? It's here somewhere. Okay, so the preface. We have already enacted many different laws bettering in certain particulars previous provisions made by us, but later found to be deficient. These laws directing our subjects how they should live. So I'm going to stop here for a second just to explain. The Code of Justinian takes all of Roman law previous and attempts to codify it and synthesize it. So that's why he's basically saying this is what he'll say that occasionally that this is to correct previous errors.
Yeah, because remember there was pre-Christian law, like the laws of the tables, the senatorial, the dictates,
right?
And then there was later laws under the Emperor Constantine, Saint Constantine, Saint Theodosius, and others.
And you're going to see he makes reference to this because that's how much deference they gave to it.
Because they already had by this time there was already over 1,000 years of Roman law, so they had to update it for additional Christian reasons.
Yeah. And so it says the present law, which regulates the most important condition of life, is a general law. For if marriage is a condition so holy as to bring immortality to the human race, perpetually renewing it through the birth of children, God, through His clemency, as far as possible, thus granting immortality to our nature, it is proper that we should give much attention to the subject. Other laws do not apply either to all men, all things, or all time. But the attention we pay to marriage interests the whole human race, for the latter is renewed by marriage alone, and hence this subject deserved more consideration than others. Now, I'm going to stop there because just the thinking you can see belying how the Roman law saw marriage and family compared to today. It's just a wide gulf. I would be very hard-pressed to argue that the U.S. government currently sees, or any Western government currently sees, the family as the perpetuation of the country.
And of the human race.
Yeah, that's vanished.
Yes.
Other laws do not apply. Okay, we read that. No great distinction was made in ancient times between first and second marriages. Fathers and mothers were permitted to marry as often as they wished without being deprived of any property thereby, and the matter was very simple. But commencing with the time of the elder Theodosius, and under subsequent emperors to Leo, the subject was treated with greater care, and the later particularly enacted many excellent laws in regard thereto. We too made many provisions on the subject in our code, but after more careful consideration have deemed it best to make amendments not only to previous laws, but also to those enacted by us. For we do not hesitate to enact into law what appears to be better than previous provisions, and to make corrections in prior laws, without waiting for someone else to make them. We shall precede this law by mentioning 2 points. The first point is that the sanctions heretofore made by us or by our predecessors shall govern the conditions and times to which they are applied, and these conditions shall not be affected by or have anything in common with the present laws, but that they and the results therefrom shall be controlled by the rules already enacted. The present law shall apply to the future and to all marriages hereafter contracted, first as well as second, and to all future marriage gains and inheritances from children. We leave everything done in the past to laws of the past, but protect future acts by the present law. Hence, past first or second marriages entered into, past succession of parents to the children of the first marriage, and past gains received through dowry or prenuptial gifts from any other source, shall remain valid, whether there are children of the second marriage or not, and both men and women shall enjoy the benefit of preceding legislation, whether they entered into a second marriage or not, or whether they inherited from children or acquired anything else pursuant to prior legislation. For it cannot be said that persons who entered into a marriage relying on the then existing laws should have also anticipated the future, should not have relied on existing conditions, but should have been in fear of something not yet existing. These matters must be upheld according to the order of things heretofore existing, but all cases in the future will be governed by this law, which will be applied as stated in connection with all marriages not yet entered into. This is the first point preceding the present law. So in this, we find that what he's doing is he's grandfathering in the old law for people who were married previously. In other words, he's saying that any new provisions to the law that he's adding will not be retroactively applied to people to penalize them. And this is very important because as much as I do like reading this particular code, it is important to remember that a lot of the code, and I'm going to skip past it when I get to it, deals with inheritance. Because that is the biggest issue in the code. It is not the legality of first or second marriage, as you will see.
In fact, if you look at the canons or the chapters of St. Theodore of Canterbury, and he came from the Roman law perspective, bringing it into England, a lot of the regulations about how long do you have to wait until after your wife or husband dies to get married has to do fundamentally with inheritance and whose child it was.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, anyway, go ahead.
Now, the second point is that whatever provisions a man or woman may make in reference to these matters in his or her testament shall be valid. Let each person, therefore, direct what is proper, and his or her will shall be law, as already expressed in the oldest law that established the Roman Republic, namely the 12 Tables, in the ancient Roman language, and in the following words: as each one directs to his affairs, so shall be the law. And no one shall have the right, even though he may obtain an imperial rescript or other permission, to direct anything contrary to such will concerning another's property. But if a testator has said nothing about these things, or has given a direction which is not covered by the present laws in force, or is not contrary thereto, then the present law shall apply, which in brief form embraces all situations as near as it is possible for men, and which relate to marriages, first and subsequent ones, to inheritances, to dissolution of marriages by death or divorce, and to the situation before and after the time of mourning, and which amends and condones the law on the subject, putting into a perfect harmonious whole legislation, formally commenced, frequently disturbed for 155 years, assembled bit by bit, and gradually gathered together, but needing correction on account of many inconsistencies. Now, this is a kind of an important point, because what he's establishing here is that effectively these laws, primarily, like especially the laws that I'm probably going to skip on the distribution of inheritance, are made under the assumption that the person has not already made a will. So if the person has already made a will, according to Roman law, that's it. That supersedes everything. And so ultimately, it's only in the case where that's not clear where the law comes into effect. But that's not really our interest, because we're not going into inheritance just yet. So we continue on. Marriage is effected by mutual consent and needs no dotal instruments. Whether marriage is entered either by mere matrimonial consent or by dowry and a prenuptial gift, dissolution thereof may follow either with or without penalty, since every tie among men may be dissolved. We are the first to determine that a penalty might be payable in case of dissolution of marriage in connection with which no dowry was given. So this is an interesting thing because he's explaining that it was the administration of Saint Justinian that began to effectively issue divorce penalties. So that's an important distinction to make. Because the reason that that's important is because previously the question of innocence or guilt of spouses was in Roman law irrelevant, but it becomes relevant now because now there is a question of guilty spouses versus innocent spouses, who is divorcing versus who is being given a bill of divorce. This makes it's a sea change in the thinking in Roman law, but it is one that brings the marriage law more in line with the scriptural teaching of our Lord, as we're going to see. Okay, so we continue. Marriages are dissolved by the parties thereto if living either by common consent and no legislation is necessary for such a case, since the agreement disposes of everything, or by some reasonable reason when the divorce is called bona gratis because of some guilt or no guilt at all. And so there's a note on this about bona gratia, and that is, it says here, as shown by chapter 17 and 14 of this novel, Justinian applied the term bona gratia to a divorce where the party divorced was not particularly at fault, as where he wanted to lead a solitary Christian life, where the other party was impotent or a captive. See novella 117, chapter 12, and there's more. In novel 140, Justinian, however, in novel 140, he understood the term by divorce bona gratia, a divorce by mutual consent. And he refers to it as such in other chapters. And he says, a proper cause exists when one of the parties chooses to live a solitary life and in chastity, which leads to better things. Another law of ours provides that a husband or wife who desires to lead a better life and retire may dissolve the marriage, leaving the deserted party a solace by giving him a small portion of his or her property. And if the parties made a contract under which the survivor, in case of death, should receive certain property, this must be left to the deserted party, whether husband or wife, since the spouse that chooses such a life is as good as dead to the other. A just cause for divorce is given when the husband is impotent and shows himself to be so for a period of 2 years, as that period was defined by former law from the time of the marriage. For the wife or her parents may dissolve the marriage and send a bill of divorce against the consent of the husband. In such case, the dowry belongs to the wife and must be returned to her by the husband. But the prenuptial gift on account of marriage remains with the husband, and he shall suffer no loss of his property. We must, however, correct this law by a small addition and make the period of impotency from the time of marriage 3 years instead of 2. For we have learned in the meantime that men that were impotent for a period no longer than 2 years subsequently became able to procreate children. So if we're taking notes, let's add that one to a note there, that impotence was actually a grounds for divorce at the time. We continue on to the next one. So also captivity is one of the cases where a reasonable excuse exists for dissolving the marriage. And whether a calamity of that kind happens to a husband when the wife remains at home or to the wife when the husband remains at home, a clear and plain reason for the dissolution of marriage exists. For when one of the parties is placed in servitude, the inequality of personal status destroys equality in marriage. But we consider the subject from a human standpoint. And so long as it is clear that the captive, husband or wife, survives, the marriage shall not be dissolved, nor shall either of them enter into another marriage, except under the penalty that the husband, if he dissolves the marriage, loses a prenuptial gift, and the wife, if she dissolves it, her dowry. It is uncertain if it is uncertain whether such captive survives, the husband or wife remaining at home must wait 5 years, at the end of which time another marriage may be safely entered into, whether the death of the captive was known or uncertain. Our predecessors, too, considered such situation sufficient for divorce bona gratia, and we concur, so that since the parties are separated, no bill of divorce is necessary, and neither party shall suffer any loss, the husband not receiving the dowry, nor the wife the prenuptial gift, but each retaining his or her own. This is one of the most commonly given few reasons in Orthodoxy for divorce, which is that of abandonment, why they say there's a 7-year wait. It comes precisely from this law. So the whole point is, if the person just straight up vanished, after 7 years, they might be dead, they might not be, we'll never know.
That was used in Russia also, and that was a common reason in Russia also.
Mm-hmm. And then it says, we must humanely abolish a certain severity exercised under the formal laws. If a man or woman was condemned to work in the mines by a judicial sentence, as now to procensus in Propontis, and to what is called gypsum, the sentence carried slavery along with it, and because of that the marriage was dissolved. We abolish this and do not permit a free-born person to become a slave by reason of punishment. We do not want freedom to be changed to a servile condition, but rather strive to become the liberator of slaves. The marriage, therefore, since it exists between free persons, shall not be affected by such a sentence. But if a freedman or freedwoman or their children are sentenced to slavery by a judicial sentence, the marriage is valid in the beginning, but is dissolved by the slavery just in the case of death, since those who lived before us said that slavery did not differ much from death. In such case, each of the married parties takes back his or her property. The agreement therein in reference to the case of death accrues to the benefit of the children alone, and the remainder belongs to the party who reduces the condemned person to slavery. So that's an interesting one, which is really kind of odd. So if you're a former slave and then you get married and then end up in slavery again, then you can divorce. If another married,
Well, I think it has to do with the fact that slaves were just freemen or former slaves were a distinct class in Roman law.
Mm-hmm.
So they were simply treated differently. So
exactly. If one marries another under the opinion that he or she is marrying a free person, but it turns out that such person is a slave, the marriage is not said to be dissolved, but that there was no marriage from the beginning on account of the inequality of status previously mentioned.
And it was that's considered really that's not divorce. That's annulment in that case. It was exactly. That's like in the Council of Trullo, they say that if a heretic, if a priest attempts to do a marriage between a heretic and an Orthodox person, then there is no marriage. They can say what are all the prayers and do all the crowning, no marriage took place. So,
okay. Now we're going to continue on here. Now, chapter 11 is again about slavery. Chapter 12 is again about slavery. Chapter 13 is about deportation. This is an update because St. Constantine basically considered that deportation was sufficient grounds for divorce, whereas Justinian says, no, that's not the case. Okay. And then we get to chapter 14, and we find we're dealing with the more famous case that's known in Orthodoxy, which is a soldier going to war. And then if he failed to communicate with his wife, a judgment of divorce could be granted. In this case, it's after 4 years, but basically, they basically make it 10 years as opposed to 4 years under Constantine, and that she has to send a letter to basically his general or his commander saying that she wishes to divorce him, to at least give the guy a chance to say, no, wait, please, let me come back. That sort of thing. And if that doesn't happen, well, then that's considered a bona gratia divorce. Now, let me see here. This is in terms of dowries, chapter 15, but this is where it gets interesting. So, we're going to read chapter 15 here. In other cases in which there is some guilt on either the part of the husband or wife, the guilty party is punished by the loss of what he or she has given, that is to say, by the loss of the dowry or gift on account of the marriage. The ancients specified many different kinds of guilt, but Theodosius the Younger enacted a constitution on divorces, adopting only some of the former grounds and adding others of his own. We too have discovered other grounds deemed by us sufficient, which involve some guilt on the one of the parties. Number 1. So if, according to the constitution of Theodosius of blessed memory, a woman can show that her husband has committed adultery, is guilty of murder, or has been engaged in poisoning and sorcery, or has participated in treason, the worst of crimes since the empire itself is attached, or has been condemned for forgery or violated sepulchres, or has pilfered from sacred edifices, or led the life of a robber, or conceals robbers, or is what is called a cattle raider, who lays in wait for cattle and sheep, driving them off, or if she proves that he is a kidnapper, or that he lives so dissolutely that in the presence of his wife associates with harlots, for it exasperates wives, especially those that are modest, to have their marriage bed violated, or if she proves that he has made attempts against the life of his wife, either by the poison or the sword or in some other manner, for the ways of crime are many, or has used a scourge upon her. If a woman can prove anything of that kind, she may send a bill of divorce, sever the marriage ties, and have her dowry as well as the prenuptial gift as her own. Trevor Bidding has asked, are these the canons from those Latin synods that allow divorce and remarriage? Nope. From the beginning of the episode, this actually comes from the Code of Justinian, which was used in the 6th century, was updated with novellae up to the 7th century, and basically became the basis of not only Roman law, but pretty much Western law throughout the world. So this is the law that existed in United Christendom in the 7th century and would lead to, I guess you could say, you can see how they lived through that. So we continue, because now we only dealt with the husbands. So, that's obviously...
Although St. Justinian was writing this in Latin, though. So
yeah. So now, nor shall it be necessary in such case to prove all of these grounds. The proof of one will be sufficient. So just one of these things. So if he's basically like a hardcore criminal and a kidnapper, or he tries to murder her, or poisoner, or he's a pagan, or he hangs out with whores, and basically like the worst possible things you could possibly think of for a husband. And it says no, but to be fair to the guys, number two, and on the other hand, the husband has permission to divorce his wife if he is found her to be guilty of adultery, poisoning, murder, kidnapping, violation of sepulchres, or theft from churches, or if she has become an accomplice of robbers or a robber, or if she, without his knowledge or against his consent, attends the banquets of strangers, or if she, against the wish of her husband, stays away from home during nights without excuse, or attends horse races in the circus or the theater where plays or things like that are put on, or fights with beasts are shown, or if she makes attempts against his life by poison or sword or in some other manner, or is an accomplice of a rebellion, or is guilty of forgery, or lays violent hands upon him. In such case, the law permits the husband to divorce his wife if he can prove one of these grounds, and will in such case have the dowry and prenuptial gift as his own.
So in other words, one spouse is not allowed to try to murder or violently do bad things to another spouse.
Or make a cuck out of them or something like that. Yes. The point is, there's those are the basic.
When you're married, you have obligations. You can't just do whatever you want.
Right.
You can't just go hanging out with all. Okay.
You can't haul around. You can't bring the. You can't. The thing is, and this is one of the things that is very difficult, I think, for modern people to understand. And what I mean by that is, we have so many me-time amusements that just reading this, I mean, I hate to say this, but if someone at the banquets of strangers, staying away from home during nights, or going to horse races, why, how dare they?
Well, Father Joseph, when I was, this to just be me remembering, when I was growing up, I remember my grandmother and my grandparents, like older people, saying that, women shouldn't be seen with a man. She shouldn't be hanging out with a man who's not a family member or, not her husband and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's actually still true in a lot of countries.
Because the concept is, people think, it's a jealous husband, but is it really the woman? You want to avoid appearance of bad things.
Why is a woman parading around a different man?
Exactly.
It's a logical question, and what the point is. Then it says, but if either of the parties sends a bill of divorce without just cause, he or she will be penalized as above states by us for the very fact of dissolving the marriage without cause. In other words, if you lie about it and try to get your spouse on a false charge, then you're guilty of it. Further,
that's part of Roman law and old ancient laws, that if you knowingly accuse someone of something false, and like you wanted the death penalty for them, hypothetically, it could resound back on you.
Now, okay, we got a question. Will you be discussing the difference between ecclesiastical divorce, the church binding and loosening, versus a secular divorce? We will touch into that, definitely.
However, I should note that they did not have this concept during the time of the Emperor Justinian. Did not consider a difference between these two things.
Right.
This is Christian law,
and that's right, because the assumption was that the marriage was a Christian marriage.
Yes.
And so that's part of the. Once you're dealing with secular law and secular divorce, this is already well past the era of the Christian nation. And I
think people misunderstand that the concept is that, from the perspective of the ancient Christians of the East and West of this period, the empire that was part of the church, because the church is all baptized and chrismated members of it. All right, and you have the difference between the hierarchy who administer the sacraments, and then you have the civil leaders like the Emperor Justinian, and they had to work in concert with each other in synergy.
All right, like I'm gonna to give an example of something that could theoretically occur, or not even theoretically occur, but in fact did occur. In the U.S., which is unforeseeable in Roman canon law for this very reason. A woman got into a relationship with another woman, and they had the whole gay marriage thing. And then one woman realized she had a biological daughter. I believe it was through artificial insemination.
Is this something you saw on the news?
No, this is a real news. This is a real news story.
Okay.
Somewhere, I guess she started going to church and she realized she wanted to live a normal life and get married, so on and so forth. So she filed for a legal divorce, and she went. I guess she got into a relationship with somebody, so she moved out and she took her daughter and went out of state. Well, then the other woman turned around and demanded custody.
The lesbian demanded custody of the reformed woman, or woman's child. Okay,
correct. And the courts gave her partial custody.
Well, you know, this would not be found in Roman law because they would not have even have allowed it to got that far.
Exactly. And so when you're talking about secular law and secular marriage and divorce versus ecclesiastical law and ecclesiastical marriage and divorce, these are two very different things. Like, the case I'm giving you here would have been laughed out of court by the authors of Justinian's Code. It wouldn't have made sense to them to begin with, because the idea behind it is illogical. And that's the point, that the modern secular society has a very different concept of marriage, as we talked about in the very beginning of when we were talking about the code, in terms of the marriage being the very thing that makes the human race immortal. It's something that is completely and totally lost upon this society. So this is part of the reason why when people start going, well, a secular divorce and a secular marriage are kind of the same thing, they're not. That might have been true if you lived in like 1910s Russia or something. That's not true now. So
even in pre-revolutionary Russia for a long time, when they had divorces, an Orthodox Christian went to a different court than a Muslim or a Jew or another person.
Right, he went to a church court.
In fact, in the law would in general enforce the imperial law would enforce those things.
Mm-hmm.
So
now we're going to add, because one thing that I should mention in the video that the troll made about whether or not I'm a deacon. He did mention, whether that I apparently initiated a civil divorce with my civil ex-spouse over an abortion. I think he misunderstood me. I said an abortion occurred. I didn't say that was what happened. But he decided to say, I'd like to see in the canon or in the, in the fathers where they say that abortion is grounds for divorce. Well, actually, we go to chapter 16. And we go to number 1, and it says, the foregoing are grounds for divorce as stated by Theodosius. We had 3 others taken from the ancient law. If a woman is so wicked as to purposely produce abortion, heaping grief upon her husband and taking from him the hope of children, or if she is frivolous, goes bathing with men out of a spirit of wantonness, or if during her marriage she negotiates with some other man as to her marriage with him, in such cases, husbands have permission to send a bill of divorce and to keep the dowry and prenuptial gift. Offenses of that kind shall give just cause for divorce and shall belong to the class fixed by Theodosius of blessed memory, which entails a penalty. So, in that sense, to answer that question, yeah, that actually was part of the tradition of the church. So, in any case, we continue on, and we'll go forward from here. Let's just get back to the novel. And let's see here. A male serf at Scriptuses shall not marry a free woman, either with or without the knowledge and consent of the owner of the land. And if the serf should do so, the owner may personally, or by order of the president of the province, cause such serf to be chastised by the scourge, and the woman thus unlawfully married to him shall be taken from him. Such union shall not be considered as a marriage, and there can be no question of dowry or prenuptial gift, but merely punishment of an impermissible act. These marriages are dissolved during the lifetime of the parties who entered into the same in the manner aforesaid, carrying with it as a matter of course the pecuniary penalty as to the dowry and prenuptial gift. So in that case, serfs could not marry out of their class. Let's see here. Hold on. That's something here. Get occasional commentary. And then we have the number 18 that deals with the question of the penalty when there was no marriage gift was made and if it was dissolved with just cause. And so effectively, this is where it starts dividing out property. Like if the man has 400 pounds of gold, he shall be penalized by the payment of 100 pounds. That is by a fourth of his property.
But what I'm getting from this, Father Joseph, it seems that the Orthodox Christian state and the Orthodox courts, even though divorce may have been very low in terms of how often people got divorced, it was enough that they had to actually deal with certain issues.
Yeah.
So they knew about the concept was known about divorce and remarriage. Okay.
Hold on 1 second. Going to fix something here. And so basically, like number 19 again, it's dealing with the question of the dowry and inheritance. I definitely recommend reading these. And then the other mode of death, I like how he puts it. Chapter 20, next follows the other mode of dissolution of marriage by death, which terminates everything.
Well, till death do us part.
Yeah, but it's the everything added to it. It's like, well, that didn't just dissolve your marriage, buddy. But in any case, that is where it begins talking about offspring, and this is where other sections, 21 talks about the gratitude of the children, and so on and so forth, about people who remarry after death, because at that point, then it becomes a question of whose property do children in the new marriage, do they acquire any of the property from the previous marriage? In general, the answer is no. The children of whichever father or mother inherit whatever was given by that father or mother. So, in that sense, and then the parent in the second marriage, it's divided among all of them. So that's the most common thing that we get there. And so that's 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. This is where we talk about second marriages and even third marriages and the question of who gets what when. And this is not just assumption of death. This is also after divorce. So let's continue on. How we go further. And then in a lot of cases, generally, the general rule, it would seem, in Justinian's code seems to always be that the ultimate goal is that the children get everything. So in the end, that makes sense.
That makes sense, because they don't want spouses trying to say, "Oh, I'll divorce my husband or my wife, and I'll take all the stuff."
Yeah, and then the kids get screwed, and then that's wrong for them, because that would defeat the purpose of marriage, which is the future generation. And this is one of the.
In other words, the marriage is not primarily about you so much about raising children, and anyway. Go ahead.
Bingo! No, you're absolutely right, Father. That is exactly. We can go all the way down to 41, where again, a father paying legacy to his own child shall not be required to give the usual bond for payment of such legacies unless he marries a second time. This shall be the penalty for men who remarry. 42. If a clergyman of a higher rank than a reader or singer enters into marriage, he shall, according to our Constitution, be deprived of his position. If a reader is married and not through some inevitable necessity subsequently marries a second time, he cannot rise higher in his priesthood, but shall remain in the rank he occupies, retaining the wife he preferred to advancement in rank.
That's 42, you say?
That's canon for chapter 42 of Novella 22.
Okay.
And it references Novella 6. And Novella 6 is interesting, Father, because it talks about the question of the marriage of bishops. This actually was a discussion on the War Zone where people were like, oh, well, that was decided by Trullo. That's incorrect. That was actually decided in the Code of Justinian, where he effectively says in the 6th novella, he says to the effect that we do recognize that there were holy men that were married, so on and so forth, but henceforth we're not going to do that because of the issues that are raised by the property of the person versus the property.
Trullo is just simply ratifying on a long pre-existing custom.
Exactly, and you can find the legal basis for that
in law
right here in Roman law in the Code of Justinian, Novella 6. And so when it's referring to this, now this is interesting because what he basically says about lower orders is that basically they have to be prepared for the chastity that comes with higher orders. And so this is kind of where that's kind of the mindset and the viewpoint that they're basing it on, is that they had a lot of very chaste readers and so on and so forth, and that they could be elevated. If a reader is married and through some inevitable necessity subsequently marries a second time, he cannot rise higher in his priesthood, but shall remain in the rank he occupies, retaining the wife he preferred to advancement in rank. Now that's an interesting question, because the way they phrase that almost implies that he would ditch his wife to see if he could be advanced.
Well, they didn't want people there. I think there actually are something in the Pedalian. There are canons against a man repudiating his wife
for higher office.
Yeah.
If a layman wants to be ordained as a subdeacon or deacon, and it subsequently appears that he's married to a woman who he did not marry as a virgin, but who separated from her husband or lived with a man in unlawful union, or is such layman himself as married a second time, he will not receive the position, and if he receives it secretly, he will be deprived thereof. Now, this is an interesting point, because this is the standard by which the church generally operates. then I'm not gonna. I wouldn't. I brought this up in the past regarding my own ordination, that the standard is and should be that. And again, this also has to do with age, and this is part of the reason why I've said this before. I'm really big on the idea of, I hate to say it, younger people taking offices. I have a problem with a 40-year-old man becoming a reader. I don't have a problem with it. Why didn't he become a reader at 20?
Well, he could have converted later in life also.
Well, yeah, and that's fine. But the point is that shouldn't be the norm. The norm is the kids are supposed to be brought up in a life of chastity.
Now, I should also note that the Emperor Justinian's chapter 42 here is a little bit more lenient, because if you start looking through the canons of the local councils, the Pedalion as a whole, you'll find that the law is that not only should the man have married a virgin, but he himself should be a virgin.
Well, yeah, I think you mentioned one. What was that from St. John the Faster, Father?
Well, I don't want to get involved in that, because I'll just tell people to read St. John the Faster's canons, because he basically says if someone did this when they were a teenager, or they did that, or whatever, that and you're told you shouldn't do it, and then you do it again later, and then like, oh no, technically you can't ever be ordained. All right. Now, if you are ordained, you still are ordained. I mean, this gets into the whole issue that people misunderstand about the canons that say someone let so not be ordained, or if it's discovered that he did so and so, let him be deposed. And this is a point that St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain makes, and I think note 7 in the Apostolic Canons, when there's notes in the Apostolic Canons, that is, even ordinations that are carried out where the person has a canonical prohibition on being ordained, the ordination still actually happens, although they may technically be liable to a deposition. All right. Otherwise, as St. Nicodemus points out, what would be the point in having a deposition trial for somebody? Why just say, oh, they never really happened? In fact, as I recall, there's only like one canon maybe that says if someone is ordained putatively under these circumstances, no ordination took place. And I believe that is a canon in the ecumenical councils, I think maybe Chalcedon, which says that if a bishop goes into another bishop's territory without his permission and does a putative ordination, that bishop should be deposed who did that, and the guy who had the putative ordination, technically he's just to be considered as nothing more than what he was before. Right. All right? Because that's a case of, you don't have, the bishop has the authority in his diocese, if you know what I mean. All right? And you go into another guy's diocese without his permission, and you start, and this has in fact happened in the early in the early 400s, when Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, who for some reason grew to dislike St. John Chrysostom. He later reconciled, I believe. But he and other people were going into St. Chrysostom's diocese in Constantinople and ordaining all kinds of people, even though St. Chrysostom said, no, you don't have the right to do this. All right? And of course, they deposed they had the whole Synod of the Oak, which was a big sham, and all the rest and such. But let me just, okay, we'll get onto that later, but that's something important to note about. Okay.
Yeah, no, we can talk about it now.
Okay, yeah, well, let me tell you, if you look in, here's if you go, I'll give you the link and you can put it in the chat, Father Joseph, to Scribd. There's a the Pedalion here. It gives you a link to the Pedalion or the rudder, and this is an issue I've been talking about for years and years and years. And I learned it when I read the Pedalion. I was taught it outside the Pedalion by my bishop. I've read in other canonical sources, and it's something that people seem to not really understand how the enforcement mechanism of the canons actually works. All right, they seem to have this idea that the canons have an ipso facto enforcement mechanism. Yeah. All right, and they do not have the only ipso facto enforcement mechanism, to be even use that phrase, that occurs in the canons, as I can recall, is the one canon of Carthage, which says that if an Orthodox bishop retakes a see that had been apostate and he holds it for 3 years, he automatically has all the rights of that see. And the other is Canon 15 of the First Second Council, which allows you to separate from a bishop who teaches heresy. All right. Okay. So Saint Nicodemus, if you go to that link and you go to, let me give you the exact page, because I have the rudder open here. If you go to the Apostolic Canons, which is very the beginning, hold on. We know, and there's a fray I'm typing in, and we know that the penalties. Okay. So it should be note 7 on the Apostolic Canons. Footnote 7 to the Apostolic Canons, page 249 to 250. And what St. Nicodemus says, the preface, the problem is there's a tremendous amount of ignorance. This is me talking, all right, or maliciousness about how the canons and their penalties actually are applied. There are very few canons that have anything like an ipso facto enforcement mechanism, like I talked about. If a canon says let him be deposed or let him be suspended for some cleric who has committed a crime or has been ordained wrongly, this presumes, as St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain says, the person is actually ordained. After all, how do you depose somebody who was never ordained if you're claiming it was ipso facto? If because they were ordained uncanonically, and supposedly invalid ordination took place, then why even have a deposition trial? And this is what St. Nicodemus says. So St. Nicodemus says the following, quote, "We know that the penalties provided by the canons, such as deposition, excommunication, and anathematization, are imposed in the third person, according to the grammatical usage. There being no imperative available. In such cases, in order to express a command, the second person would be necessary. I will explain the matter better. The canons command the council of living bishops to depose the priests, or to excommunicate them, or to anathematize laymen who violate the canons. Yet, if the council does not, actually effect the deposition of the priests, or the excommunication, or the anathematization of the laymen, they are neither actually deposed, nor excommunicated, nor anathematized. They are, however, according to St. Nicodemus, continuing, they are, however, liable to stand judicial trial here with regard to deposition, excommunication, and anathematization, but there with regard to divine vengeance." So just to stop. So in other words, even if a bishop doesn't depose somebody or doesn't suspend or excommunicate somebody, and they continue to serve as a priest, they're still a priest, but they still have God's vengeance over them. All right. Okay, so St. Nicodemus continues and says, just as when a king commands a slave to whip another who did something that offended him, if the slave in question fails to execute the king's command, he will nevertheless be liable to trial for the whipping. So those silly men make a great mistake who say that at the present time, all those in holy orders who have been ordained contrary to the canons are actually deposed from office. It is an inquisitional tongue that foolishly twaddles, thus without understanding, the commands of the canons without the practical activity of the second person, or more plainly speaking, of the council, remains unexecuted, since it does not act of itself and by itself immediately and before judgment. The apostles themselves explain themselves in their canon 66 unmistakably, since they do not say that any bishop or presbyter who accepts a baptism performed by heretics is already and at once deposed, but rather they command that he be deposed, or at any rate that he stand trial. And if he be proven that he did so, then we command that he be stripped of holy orders, they say, by your decision. The only time in which one can act again without a council of bishops is over basically heresy. That's the Canon 15 exception. In fact, the reason the fathers codified that was they didn't want people saying, well, bishops can go on teaching heresy and we can't do anything about it. We just got to hope it goes away, right? Do you see the point that, even if someone was ordained with a canonical impediment, whether that's supposedly a real or imagined, whether it can be given economy or not, and whatever you think about it, this does not mean an ordination did not take place. This is why in history we have cases of like Theophilus Lecapanos, who was the Patriarch of Constantinople like in the 920s for 20 years, who was the nephew of the Emperor Romanus, and he was like consecrated either at the age of 16 or 18, which is really uncanonical. But he was still technically made a bishop, and he did make a bunch of, and if someone were to say, oh, he was never validly consecrated a bishop, that would have a lot of implications because he ordained like 100 bishops or something like that. It would have been no church in Asia Minor. All right. So you can have these cases. It's just like, for example, a similar case is the age requirements for ordinations. And this is something I've always been interested in because I think one of the canons of Trullo, I cannot remember which canon of Trullo, says that, and it's repeating previous canons, it says that ordination for a priest is 30, for a deacon is 25, and for a subdeacon is 20. Okay. Now, Trullo's canon is unique in that it says if someone's ordained below the canonical age, they have to be deposed. All right. So they're actually considered ordained to an office, but technically they shouldn't have been done it. Then a situation has to go through a deposition, but they're still a priest until the deposition takes place. However, the problem is that according to many of the fathers, like St. Nicodemus, but even the Russian fathers, the problem is that there were many cases in which the church chose to economize the deposition thing on under 25 or under 30, and basically make clergy who, for example, you look in the Russian church, even in Rokor up until, I guess, the 60s, or some even later, you were having people made priests at 27 or 28 or 29. In Russia, and at 22, 23, as soon as they graduated from seminary.
Yeah.
All right. And so, obviously, this is what St. Nicodemus is talking about. St. Nicodemus's point is that you may not like it may not be the ideal situation, but it's ridiculous to say all these people automatically are deposed or never were ordained. In fact,
well, one of the things that I should point out, I just want to interrupt for a second, Father, is that the subdiaconate is generally assumed to be, when that's generally when the concept of whether you can marry or not pretty much ends. And
yes, so, unless there's the exemption granted by Sardica, which is an interesting canonical point.
But
which applies to Deacon technically well, anyway.
But my point is that a 20-year-old, that would mean that, people, when they say, "Oh, I'm going to wait till much later to get married," that's not the way the canons presuppose it.
Well, a man reaches majority age, his adulthood, essentially in the Roman world of Byzantium, when he was 15.
Yeah,
he was expected to get married actually when he was around 15. That was actually, that was actually when that was when he could get married, at least,
Right. So the point I'm trying to make is this whole concept that's part of the reason why I want to, my goal is to, see younger people going into church offices and getting married. Take the risk; it's worth it. Or say,
I should note real quick about the age issue. That again, when Saint Boniface, who was an Anglo-Saxon missionary in the early 700s to Germany, when he basically was baptizing tens of thousands of people, oftentimes hundreds of people at a time, whole areas were being converted. And one of the problems Saint Boniface had was that he had hardly any priests. All right, yeah, basically people he took with him from England, and maybe some people he could get from France or whatever. So people were like dying without sacraments, no confession, no Eucharist, no unction. And he wrote a letter to St. Zachary, who was the Bishop of Rome at the time. And St. Zachary is mostly famous for a lot of people because he was the one who translated the dialogues of St. Gregory the Great into the Greek language. That's how St. Gregory became known as the Dialogus. And St. Zachary answers and says the following. He says, quote, "You ask whether a man may be ordained priest before his 30th year. It is well and fitting, beloved, that men of mature years and of good report should be ordained priests according to the sacred canons, if such can be found. But if not, and the need is urgent, let men of 25 and upward be ordained priests and deacons, as is provided by the law of God." You can find that in the letters of St. Boniface, especially the replies of Zacharias to Boniface. So do you see the point is that urgency? That's the economy issue.
Right.
So the concept is that you let 50,000 people die because you don't have enough people converted who have spent the 5 or 6 years to get to the age of 30, or do you ordain 10 or 12 men priests who are 25, 26, 27 and who are reliable?
Well, I think that the sense of urgency that has developed, and I think that this is global, but it is true, especially among Orthodox in the West, is that we have so systematized the issues related to ordination, especially even to the minor orders, where we basically turn the minor orders into nothing, which is why you have some of the world Orthodox, using altar girls and stuff like that. We've taken away the sense of the sacred from youth. We've said this is something for the old, and that's the greatest of sins I could possibly imagine.
I mean, you did have in the ancient early modern world, you did have people who were readers and they were 50, but they have been trained readers when they were like 20 though.
Yeah.
That was what they stayed. They stayed as readers, and because that was their
job.
But my point is still about the issue with the canons is that anybody who has studied canon law, who has Orthodox canon law, that has studied St. Nicodemus, has studied the great Slavic canonist who died in 1915, who's probably a saint, Nicodemus Miloš. Yes, who was basically essentially tortured to death by the Austro-Hungarians and the Roman Catholic authorities because he would not basically retract things he had written about the Council of Carthage. You have people like Father John Krasinski, I believe, who was archimandrite in the 19th century. They would have said that you have to do a deposition, even if somebody was ordained contrary to the canons, they were still a deacon, priest, or bishop until you actually have a deposition.
Yeah.
Otherwise, as the problem would be much more complicated, because if you read, like, I think note 76, that's in either the one of the canons of I think Patriarch Tiresias, or maybe St. Nicodemus's note. If you can find that, if you look on that edition of the Pedalion I gave, you look on page 1567. St. Nicodemus talks about simony. All right, and basically St. Nicodemus laments the fact that most of the Greek priests in his days were ordained simonically. They were paying their bishops to make them more, or the bishops, because they were so bad in many cases, were charging people to make them priests.
Yeah.
Okay, and technically the canon says, let such a person be deposed. So St. Nicodemus was writing because people were saying, well, heck, all these people are simonically ordained, half the Greek priests, or most of them, therefore there are no priests, there's no priesthood left, everything is gone. And there were, in fact, weird quasi-all-believer groups in Greece, believe it or not, in the 18th century, that were like saying stuff like that.
Yeah.
All right, and people were just like not going to church at all. All right, so I'm not defending that. Those people who were simonically ordained have to be deposed, but until they actually are deposed, as much as you may not like them, they still are priests. You know, although I've never myself seen a simoniac or heard a simoniac ordination. I don't know how often that is even now. So,
I doubt it's even often now.
but it was a big issue in the Ottoman period, believe it or not, because basically the Sultan was demanding money from the Patriarchate. The Patriarchate was taxing the metropolitans, who taxed the bishops, who taxed the priests, who taxed
taken down under the Turkish.
Exactly. And as bad as that is, that still technically does not excuse simony.
No, yeah,
right? Okay. Anyway, so that's the big spiel I wanted to make, because I've been dealing with this issue for years and years and years, where people are misunderstanding how the canons are applied.
And they're like, deposed. No.
Yeah, exactly. And I've heard people say, you know, I'm going to go there and I'm going to denounce somebody of their priesthood in the church, and then they're not going to be a priest anymore. And I say, what do you mean? Yeah, and they say, well, I'm going to read from the canons. Well, I says, that's not how it works. That's not how any of it works. All right, unless a bishop or a metropolitan or an archbishop or whatever is publicly teaching heresy condemned by the Holy Fathers and councils, you know, and even that case, it says you don't even wait for deposition trial. That could theoretically happen later. You just leave. You know, technically, if they're now Saint Nicodemus Miloš, the Serbian canonist, says that you got to make sure this is not just he's ignorant or he made a mistake or he misspoke. All right, because theoretically that could happen. But if it's clear what he's doing is heresy, and he won't retract, then you have to leave. Yes, and then it says wait. Whatever a council decides later, that's their business. But you just separate. Okay. Anyway, that's the point I wanted to make. So somebody says I don't like this person because they were ordained and they shouldn't have been ordained, and therefore no, they couldn't have been ordained. That's not how the canons operate. People have been throughout history been ordained with canonical impediments. Some can be economized, some cannot. But that does not mean they are automatically deposed.
Okay, now I want to answer this question that we have up here before we get to Sean's second question, which is, other than leaving the Orthodox Church, why do you suspect the Latin Church stopped allowing divorce and remarriage? I think that the answer to that, at least on my end, it seems to be based around, once again, the Gregorian reform, the Hildebrandian controversy, because they didn't just reform the priesthood where they claimed that, you know, married priests were effectively whoremongers. They, you know, reframed the concept of marriage alongside that. So they made it where you were basically married or going to the priesthood. So they kind of created a whole new theology of marriage that didn't exist, a heretical theology of marriage. That we see reflected in the much broader use of annulments and the slow reduction in the use of divorces. And that process took about 100 years. But that I would say that it's interrelated with that, with this imaginary concept of a purity of marriage or a purity of the priesthood that didn't really exist. Not that they weren't pure, because the bed was undefiled, but that they weren't pure according to the Hildebrandians. So they had to redefine marriage, and they redefined the priesthood along those lines.
Yes, and remember, there's the work of who was the Italian bishop that wrote against Nicholas II, trying to enforce the priests not stay with their wives.
Ulrich of Imola.
Ulrich of Imola gave reference to the tradition about St. Gregory the Dialogus thinking about banning priests from staying with their wives, and then he had a vision of all these skulls of children, basically. that it would, in other words, it would result in a lot of bad stuff. So he didn't go through with it. Okay.
Now, Sean asks, when the 14th canon of the First Second Synod speaks of a crime, is this a crime in a secular sense?
Okay, the 14th canon of the First Second Synod?
Yeah, the one right before leaving for
Before 15. Okay, hold on, let me look. Okay, so that's going to be on the local, they're going to be technically classified
my
as...
sense is it's going to be about an ecclesiastical crime, but Father can check that.
Okay, all right, hold on. Canon 14 of the First Second Council. Okay. I'm going to send you the link here, Father Joseph, you can read along with.
I have the
link. All right. Okay, so Canon 14 of the First Second Council, if any bishop, is that how it starts, if any bishop?
Right.
Any bishop on the allegation that charges of crime lie against his own metropolitan shall secede or apostatize from him before conciliar or synodal verdict has been issued against him, and shall abstain from communion with him, and fail to mention his name in accordance with the consuetude in the course of the divine mystagogy, the Holy Councils decree that he shall be deposed from office. If merely by seceding from his metropolitan he shall create a schism. For everyone ought to know that he is his own bounds, and neither ought a presbyter to treat his own bishop scornfully or contemptuously, nor ought a bishop to treat his own metropolitan so. This is in fact repeated in Canon 15. In fact, Canon 15 says there's no reason you can secede or apostatize from your own patriarch or metropolitan unless it's for case of heresy. So you may think the metropolitan, he ordained bad people, or he's not very good at preaching, or he's not administering he's not a very good administrator, or whatever. You know what I mean? That none of those are reasons for non-commemoration. The only reason for non-commemoration is heresy. That's now hypothetically schism. Technically, if the synod of bishops deposed him, then he's not even a bishop. Technically, you could say technically schism if he goes into schism, and just says I'm going to create my own stuff or whatever, and he's got no legitimate reason. Then that's a schism, But that still technically falls under the the kind of the idea of Canon 15. So what was the question about 14, Canon 14? I'm confused as to...
Is it a crime in a secular sense? And I would say no, it's a crime in an ecclesiastical sense.
Well, technically the government, if you did... Now, and I can tell you the emperor or the imperial police or the imperial magistrates, if like somebody back in the 1860s was like, I'm not going to commemorate the bishop, and they'd be like, why? I just don't like him. He's too fat or something like that. They would have been like, you can't stay in. This is not your. You couldn't stay in. You couldn't have continued to stay in the church and do whatever you wanted because technically you didn't own it.
Right, but then now technically we can flip that around, and if we take that in 1860 imperial police and that layman says, oh well, the bishop stole 1,000 gold pieces from the imperial treasury, now it's a whole different story.
Well, at that point, then they're going to do an investigation.
Yeah, that's not Canon 14 anymore. That's just.
I mean, if now technically he still shouldn't cease commemoration, even if he says he stole the money. What would happen in Russia probably is that they either tell him to continue commemorating, or maybe the patriarch would say something like, just commemorate me. I don't know. Something like me, the Metropolitan Mosque. I'm not exactly sure. But if they're talking about how that could be a secular crime, a lot of the canons were enforced, believe it or not, secular from the civil authorities. I shouldn't say secular, but the civil authorities.
Yeah.
They just would not let people, continue to do stuff. I mean, against the canons, they'd simply say, well, look, the bishops decided that you're not a priest anymore. You've been deposed. You can't stay in this church, which is technically owned by the, either a chapel of the state or a chapel of the emperor, or it's a chapel owned by the local, operated by the local diocese. And they would enforce those laws, So, because there was no separation of church and state. That did not exist like it did in the later 20th century. Such. But even in the 20th century, if technically, like the diocese here, if we own a chapel, like one of our churches in Woodstock or in another area up in New York or whatever, if somebody decided to leave us and they still wanted to do services in that building, in a temple of ours, in Mayopac or whatever, it could be anywhere, we would simply say, no, you can't. And if they're still doing it, we can in fact call the police and say, this is our property, you can't do this. I mean, you can technically even do that today. You know what I mean? As long as you own the property. So, okay.
All right. Now, now we have covered quite a bit here because we've covered, the reality of the existence of divorce and remarriage in the Christian world, in the Christian empire. We covered the canon we covered the law in the Code of Justinian concerning second marriages, and whether those clergy should be ordained. And we did cover as Father pointed out rather vociferously, the fact that let him be deposed does not mean he's automatically deposed, but that there has to be some sort of counsel for it. Now, I want
to. In fact, just jump in here. When a priest has to be deposed, or trial has to be, even investigation for suspension or whatever, like even like a trial for suspension and then later deposition, you have to have at least 6 or 7 bishops, according to the strict application of the canons.
Yeah. Now,
and in fact, if a bishop is accusing you of something, he cannot be a judge in a deposition trial. So if your own bishop says, "I accuse you of this," and blah blah blah, he technically can't even sit on the deposition trial for the person.
Now, you pointed to, I know you showed me this book a while back, and it was actually kind of interesting because you showed a quote from Theodore of Cyrus in terms of the ordination of Didymus. I don't know if you remember.
Is this something that is mentioned in Tentativa Theologica?
No, this one's mentioned in Antiquities.
Oh, okay. The Antiquities of the Christian Church by Bingham, I think, right?
I'm going to put up a link here because I just want to read the quote from Theodoret. Just to nail.
Now, in fact, I should mention, if you can find the letter of St. Jerome to Oceanus, the presbyter, they mentioned this problem going out where people were trying to tell St. Jerome that, baptism, if a person was married before baptism and their wife died and they got divorced and they get baptized, they can't, and then they get remarried after baptism. People trying to tell St. Jerome that, that counts. And St. Jerome was like, no, if that's the issue, then half the priests in the world are digaments or something like that.
Yeah.
Because he was saying that's happened a tremendous amount of time. And that's, in fact, what is it? Canon 17, I believe. Apostolic Canon 17, I'm thinking about, actually mentions that only marriages that happen in the church after baptism, in other words, after joining the church, actually count. That's only when things begin to count.
Just to establish my personal thing, I have only had one marriage in the church.
Yes, I understand. Yes.
I know you know that, Father, but just for those who think that I was married twice in the church, none of that's true.
I mean, I could probably start naming a few people back in Roquefort in the 80s and 70s and 60s. I mean, we're not going to do that, but I mean, theoretically,
we named one priest, and I think
and they were not necessarily evil people or anything. My point is that the bishops in Roquefort in the 70s would have said, well, was this marriage after he converted to the church or before he converted to the church?
Yeah,
that's exactly what they would have said. All right, and that's how it would have been handled. All right.
Okay, so now. In this, I put this quote up because what you find here on page, what was this? You find it on page 66, where he basically is talking about. It mentions that with various fathers, they had different views on how to interpret the husband of one wife. So points out basically was referring to it as against polygamous marriage. Tertullian owns that there were bishops among, as he puts it, the Catholics who have been twice married, although in his style that was an affront to the apostle. But Theodore is probably the biggest.
Saint Theodore Cyrus, right?
Yeah, Theodore of Cyrus.
Okay.
And he ordained, agreeably to his own notion, ordained one Irenaeus bishop who was twice married. And when some objected to the legality of the ordination upon that account, he defended it by the common practices of the other churches. And he quotes him saying, "Herein I followed the example of my predecessors. Alexander, bishop of the Apostolic See of Antioch, with Acacius of Berea, ordained Diogenes, a digamist, and Pralius ordained Domninus of Caesarea, a digamist likewise. Proclus, bishop of Constantinople, received and approved the ordination of many such, and so do the bishops of Pontus and Palestine, among whom no controversy is made upon." So that's an interesting thing, because that means that, again, we know the rule. And the rule is correct that you should not ordain digamists. Does that mean that a bishop cannot ordain digamists? It means he shouldn't, but if he sees reason, it's like the prohibition on age, then he can.
Well, that's exactly what St. Zachariah says, but if there's an urgent need.
Right. Now, I'm not even going to argue whether there's an urgent need, because I see no purpose in doing that. But if we could just theoretically put it on a different person, well, I don't know, call him, Father Jim. And the point is that in a situation where he arose, from my perspective, if he was only married once in the church, but somebody wanted to argue that he was married twice, if the bishop thought he was worthy, so be it.
And if you don't agree with it, he's still ordained, even if you think it was incorrect.
And then what you have to do is you have to petition for a canonical trial.
Exactly.
And since nobody's actually done that, and people assume that, canonical trials can be, done by individual lay people on YouTube.
By facts.
Yeah. And so, did we do the shift from the married episcopate yet? Asked Sean. We touched on it because Trullo codified an existing tradition, and what we were pointing out was that Novella 6 of the Code of Justinian, if you look at the first link, that's one of the novellas of Justinian. But if you look at Novella 6, it talks about how there were, in previous times, holy bishops who were the husband of one wife, but that would no longer be the case, and that bishops would have to remain chaste. And it makes a point of general chastity throughout all the ranks of the priesthood, which is why it becomes much more limiting towards clergy in the lower orders. But again, we're talking about the golden age of the church. It's one of the greatest times to be a Christian, where everyone was being a Christian. All the kids were listening to their parents, and all the parents were teaching their kids good morals. We don't live in those times. And I'm sorry to say, I mean, not that I'm justifying the marriage to actresses, because I would never do that. But what I would say is this: when you're talking about the question of a divorced woman was often considered of ill repute because usually she was the one who received the bill of divorce back.
She was well, yeah, exactly.
And the point I'm trying to make is that in that particular, a woman who divorces a man who gets a bill of divorce, and she's generally considered innocent. We could argue the whole virgin thing, but I'm sorry to say this, and this is going to sound, forgive my immodesty, but I know of people who are close to me, who would refer to themselves, even though they were effectively virgins, but they thought, thanks to modern day programming, that they were supposed to be pansexuals or, something to that effect, even though they hadn't even had relations with anyone yet. Meanwhile, you could have somebody who was raised by fairly pious parents, gets pregnant early, thinks that she's going to get married, gets married early, it turns out to be an abusive mess, and the guy turns out to be some sort of sicko pervert. And so that ends in a horrible divorce, so on and so forth. Now, you ask me this, now let's say, said girl finds Orthodox church, and let's say said pansexual person, lady, doesn't.
What is a pansexual? I don't even know what that is.
In other words, somebody who just wants anything.
Okay, that's pretty bad. Okay, good.
But the point I'm trying to make now, the person on the left is technically a virgin. For whatever.
Well, this is technically when you start getting into things. If you read again, the canons of St. John the Faster and others.
Yeah.
Well, they had it, their idea of like just because you could say, oh, technically he's they were like say there's others. They would say all sexual activity, whatever it is, any kind of lustful activity is prohibited before marriage completely. And in fact, any such activity would in fact disqualify normally a person from even being made a priest, or even there was if you look that's why I ask people, anyway. So those are very strict laws, and the question is, why did they pass such laws? Were they kind of ideals, or they did? I think they were more than ideals of Father Joseph. I think of that period of time,
they weren't. They were how they lived.
Yes, I think in fact you had such a lot. Even if a large number of people did things that were not right, you still had even if like 15 or 20% of the population didn't, Father Joseph, or the male population, that's still a tremendous amount of point of the population to draw from. Mm-hmm. All right, to making clergy. All right.
So that's in that sense, they could. I mean, I don't want to sound like they could afford to, pick higher quality people, but to the degree that they had more higher quality people, that makes a lot of sense. I'm not saying we should just justify ordaining every low quality.
No, I agree exactly.
But what I'm saying is this: is that we have to have. They made economy for issues. That is why there were rules concerning divorces and remarriages and guilty parties and innocent parties. We live in a society that is so warped that the concept of marriage and family life has already been largely eradicated. It can no longer be trusted for a guideline in which a healthy society can be built. And from that perspective, you're going to get, I have no problem with dealing with people who have a few, indiscretions that they repented from. I'd rather deal with that than deal with deal with people having the illusion of purity when inside there's nothing but festering sin.
Yeah, and then something bad happens afterwards.
Exactly.
So they're like they if you start priding yourself, well, I didn't do this, and then then you become worse in other ways, if not that way eventually. So, all right, do we want to continue reading from the novella?
That's actually pretty much the end of the novella. After that, it's mostly like let me see here. Okay, there's let's see, women, although second marriage was forbidden by the first husband, left them property. This is another property thing, and then bequeaths the property. This is another property thing. And
does it have a law? This might be another. Anyway, go ahead.
What? No.
Well, I was wrong. See, I know in the Capitula or the canons of Saint Theodore of Canterbury, it stipulates that a woman is not allowed to marry until about 10 or 11 months after her husband dies, whereas a man can marry about 30 to 40 days, about 40 days after his wife dies. And I
don't think I read the full novella.
Well, I was just wondering, and the reason that is, just we're talking about marriage, is because technically the woman could still be, even if she were to get allowed to be married sooner, she could technically be pregnant with a child from her husband, from the previous husband, if you know what I mean. And that would involve inheritance issues, whose baby that really is. Whereas a man doesn't have that issue. He just has to wait till after the 30 or 40th day is over for commemoration of the dead. All right.
That wasn't actually. I don't think that was actually listed there. It might be in there. It
might be in another novella or another instituted law, because I think. Anyway.
And then after that, it's just basically the epilogue, which just talks about where copies of the novella were sent and so on and so forth. And so,
okay.
I think basically the point that there's a few.
So the papists would argue that that Justinian was just simply issuing heretical decrees. I mean, because I guess that
no sense.
Because technically, I guess they view, if you believe in divorce and remarriage, they view that as a dogmatic issue, and you're a heretic. Technically, that's ultimately what they believe about it. So they'd have to argue that the Christian Empire, which included Italy at this time and parts of Spain and North Africa, was essentially living under issued heretical laws, even though nobody, as far as I understand, they weren't anathematizing the Code of Justinian as heretical, were they? I don't recall that.
I don't think so. They probably created it. My guess is, because remember that one of the things about the Hildebrandian changes was the separation of the church from the state in terms of the harmonia that existed before.
Yeah, the concept was that the hierarchy was like the Pope was the supreme. He had temporal and spiritual supremacy.
Right. He became he was
like the God Emperor almost.
Yeah.
The Pope God Emperor is how they viewed him, and that was how they tried to get it. But even then there was actually so much resistance from.
They had a whole other Pope trying to stop it.
But even ultimately, remember, even after the schism, the kings of France, for example, never went in. That was where kind of Gallicanism or the older view is kind of hung on for some time.
Yeah,
where they would simply the King of France would say, the Pope has no power to depose me. This just makes no sense. So.
Well, I think that in that sense, I think we covered a lot of ground on today's show. So I think that's what we're unless there are other questions. I don't know, Sean. I mentioned novella 6. Let me see if I can just get that for you so that you have it. You can actually read a legal arguments. The legal basis by which the married episcopate was shifted away from. Hold on one second.
Now, and we should also mention by married episcopate, technically, a married man can be elected to be a bishop, but his wife has to take monastic vows and go be a nun.
Yeah, and that's
in fact what the canons. That's what Trullo states. Actually,
that is actually mentioned in the. Sixth novella.
So, I mean, in a certain sense, he's still married, in the sense that they didn't get divorced, I guess, but it's not married like how we think of it as married. You know what I mean? It's not that's not exactly the same.
Hold on, here you go, Sean. Novella 6. So that should let me see what chapter that would be at.
I mean, there was one pope, I believe, like Stephen V or something like that. That was when he was elected pope in the 80s or 90s.
Yeah.
I think he was like in his 70s, and he was like married. He had been a married man, but his wife lived and his daughter lived in this other part of the papal complex, and they were like in a house of virgins or something like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes people bring that up, but that's not really. That's like what we're talking about. They kind of became nuns. It's not the pornocracy where like the 10th century, the popes were like having prostitutes and things like that all the time.
Yeah, basically all of chapter 1 covers what he was talking about in novella 6. So that's probably that's a good read on that one. And let me think. Are there any other questions we have in the chat? If not, we can always just go back to
the council. Now it's interesting to note that the Council of Gangra, which is a local council of Gangra, actually anathematized a heretic called Eustathius because he taught that people should separate from presbyters that still retain their wives. So technically, there's, but that's exactly what was actually going on in the late Hildebrandian period, where people were saying that if a presbyter has a wife, even if he's not sleeping with her, you can't even go to his masses. Yeah. All right. So, I mean, because, for example, even after the schism, and of course I'm not defending that, even after the Hildebrandians technically took over and they got rid of any counterpope, they didn't even wipe out the married episcopate essentially in England. The open married priesthood, not episcopate. They didn't wipe out the open married priesthood in England up until like 1180 or something like that.
Yeah.
Because
it out.
Well, yeah, what happened is that in the Council of Worcester in 1070, after the Normans invaded, Lanfranc had, I guess, wanted to kind of get rid of the married clergy, but there's just so much opposition. So what they said is that, well, from now on, the village priests are allowed to keep their wives. All right. But from now on, we're not going to ordain any more married men. All right. The problem is that even them trying to enforce that in the 1070s proved impossible. All right, because the tradition of having, at least ordaining a married man was just essentially because oftentimes these priests would have children who would then later take over the parish church as priests. All right, so but they kind of eventually did get rid of that. Although that created even worse situations in the 13th and 14th century. Where like I know in Portugal or Spain or in Italy, you had the concept of like the priests, kind of having concubine wives or something like that. That probably happened. That happened in England too, I know. So it kind of made the situation worse. I
think to some degree, I wonder how many of those priests were actually just falsely accused.
Yeah, well, you could always accuse somebody of having a concubine or having a wife.
Well, they accused married priests in Italy and other places of concubines.
Well, and this was the problem, because the problem was that oftentimes concubina and uxor were oftentimes just simply meant wife. All right, Latin we're taught that uxor actually can kind of mean a man's woman. It just means his woman, But oftentimes the word uxor has the higher status of wife. But the real difference between a concubina and a uxor was that one, you could be married in the 10th century in Italy before you're ordained. You could be married in a service where the priest pronounces the blessing. Everything is done. All right. You have your legal certificate, and you're going to be married forever. You intend to, but technically, your wife might be considered a concubina or an uxor, depending upon inheritance issues. You know what a morganatic marriage is? I don't know if you've heard of that term. Or where the children, I think it's the children don't technically inherit some of the property,
right?
Or they don't inherit titles. If your wife was considered to be concubina legally, and that oftentimes happened because a man might marry a woman of lower status. Or vice versa.
That's an unequal social range.
Exactly. So they might allow that, but the family is like, well, we don't want these, these children becoming counts or whatever, So the marriage would happen, and if they do it a religion, and if they do the sacramental service, it's a marriage, assuming there's, he's not a heretic or she's not a heretic or whatever. But they oftentimes when they use the word concubine, they were kind of playing fast and loose, the Hildebrandians and others, because do they mean concubine in the negative sense of just a perpetual kind of woman hanging out with the guy and he's sleeping with her, or do they mean concubina in the lesser sense of a wife who could marry a man and her children could not inherit the property?
Well, yeah. What I think that does is what they did is they kind of used that.
If you conflate those things, then it becomes like, oh no,
every wife is a sub-introductor.
Exactly. So, whereas what Nicaea is talking about in the sub-introducta is basically kind of like a bishop or priest having a woman live in his house, and who's not above suspicion.
Now, Sean says he's reading the 6th novella right now. He thinks ecumenists push forward, and he wants to be ready. I tend to think ecumenists, while some may push for the married episcopate, are pushing for a whole lot of other stuff that's a lot worse. So I wouldn't.
I'm not going to defend having a married.
Yeah, we're not defending having a
No.
married episcopate, but when they're kind of pushing.
Well, there are issues. See, there are issues like when they had the council in the 1920s in Constantinople. Like the big renovations thing, the Congress or whatever. There were issues they were bringing about the married episcopate or marriage, a second marriage after ordination, and they could like have some sort of argument for these, but they weren't bringing these up because they had great respect and veneration for the antiquity of the canons. That's not why they were bringing this stuff up.
Yeah.
They're bringing it up because they wanted to change the way people in Orthodoxy thought about stuff. I mean, when people introduced the new calendar, it wasn't because, oh, well, I mean, there may have been some people that thought that, but the majority of them weren't thinking, well, this has to be more accurate and blah, 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 all the rest. They were doing it because they were doing it, well, we know why they did. 1920 encyclical says they did it for ecumenist reasons, all right? So, I mean, the humanists and modernists often will bring up, especially modernists, like these little points like that, but they're not bringing them because they have, they'll be glad to disrespect the canons and the ancient tradition, all kinds of other issues. And they'll just talk about one little thing here. For example, like Sardicus says that if a bishop wants to really ordain somebody to be a deacon, all right, but he's like, and the man is like, well, I still want to get married. And the bishop really, really insists that the bishop can ordain him a subdeacon and a deacon and give him a promise saying that he can marry later after, that's actually in the Canon Sardica, after ordination as a deacon, because they really needed a deacon there. Because some places they may not have a priest, and the deacon at least can give communion to people, and such. And in fact, now this kind of got abused much later, like in the 9th and 10th century, up into around the year 1100, they actually had a problem in Byzantium, where bishops were in fact, contrary to what the canons state, were allowing in some cases men to be made priests. So what they would do is they were saying, bishops were reasoning wrongly in Asia Minor that, well, it's a diaconal promise, but we really need to make a priest for this village. So let's just ordain them subdeacon, deacon, priest all on like 2 days, and then just extend the diaconal promise later. They kind of clamped down on that in Constantinople, and the Patriarchate did around like 1100, because technically that shouldn't have been allowed. All right. Yeah. And so, I mean, they kind of stopped that from continuing things like that. Anyway.
Well, other than that, let me see if there's. I don't see any questions coming up, so I'm going to see what we've got on the war zone and see if there's anything we want to bring up. I'll just go through the most recent things. Let's see here. Top link right now, Craig Trillia shared a link. He's on, he does that other show, and he occasionally does it with Eric Ibarra. I forget what it's called, but it's an interesting discussion thing. But he has an article about the Orthodox Marian doctrine, the Immaculate Conception, and the early church. It isn't a bad article. I mean, I read it. It does make a good number of patristic references. Not so much.
Well, I disagree. This concept that we need to understand we are not separated by much in principle. I do not believe that's.
And I'm not. Well, I wasn't a fan of him saying that St. John's thing was insufficient.
Because I sense this kind of this ecumenism kind of coming through. I think that's extremely bad for that, detrimental. That's completely detrimental to apologetics.
Yeah, I like Craig.
He's not true Orthodox. I think he's Antiochian or something.
He's Antiochian, but he presents a good argument, but he always has to apologize for it, which I don't see a reason for. But in any case, that's it. Let's go to the next one here. What do we got here? Compline with the Monophysites. And this is like 2 weeks old. We've covered this a few times.
The Serbian Patriarchate and the Antiochian Patriarchate engaged in joint prayer with the Monophysite heretics.
Yeah, it's devolved into stuff about Jacobites, which I don't even think we were talking about.
Well, technically, the Antiochians have this worked out communion agreement with them for limited.
The Jacobites are with the Monophysites.
The Jacobites are the Syro. They're called the Syro Jacobites. They are Monophysites.
I thought the Okay, wait. I thought
they're not the Scottish Jacobites.
No, I was talking about the Church of the East people.
Oh, they're not called Jacobites. They're the Church of the East or the Assyrian Church of the East. They're historians. Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's an issue of the ecumenical heresy and that issue. So.
And, let's see. Then there was a quote from a Monophysite saying that Nestorius approved of the Tome of Leo.
Well, the problem with this is a lot of heretics will say that they all agree with like previous fathers.
Yeah, we agree with stuff that they selectively agree with. The point is Nestorius was condemned by the church too. So, It's not like,
and how do they even interpret it to begin with? You know, I mean, the heretics oftentimes like, for example, Pelagius. Like a lot of, there's only been, Pelagianism was like a heresy like Enoslavi. It was kind of constantly morphed and had a moving target where they could always evade some condemnation. Like when Pelagius was called before a council of bishops of Jerusalem by St. John of Jerusalem, they began to ask him all kinds of questions. Do you believe you need the grace of God to be saved, etc.? And he'd say yes. And the council was like, well, I guess this guy, we exonerate him. And St. Augustine said, this is the plague of Pelagianism, where Pelagius will say one thing, and in the minds of the hearers, they'll think that's orthodox. But Pelagius really means something different.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Now, the next one was an interesting one. Apparently, there was a discussion. I was slightly involved in it. I said I would cover some of this on the show because I wanted to get your view on it, where a fellow named Emmanuel basically was arguing. He was arguing that, he was something about biblical inerrancy, but he was talking about the two different genealogies of Christ in Matthew and Luke. And so, basically, he was wondering whether one was for the Theotokos, one was for St. Joseph, but tradition has the Joachim and Anna are the parents of the Theotokos. I mean, in the discussion, I pointed out that, the fathers in general see the lineage of David coming through the Theotokos, not through St. Joseph. He wasn't involved at all.
I think there's another explanation as to the two alternate genealogies.
Well, his bigger concern is if the lineage of the Theotokos was the seed of David, why wasn't St. Joachim mentioned?
First off, there's a traditional patristic explanation for this.
Yeah.
Now, I should mention that the idea that the genealogies, or one is of Theotokos, one is St. Joseph, I think you may find that in some ancient writers, but that's really been something used by Orthodox writers in the past few hundred years.
Yeah, it's not a traditional.
Yeah, I mean, you may find it in some ancient writers, but their older argument, as I recall, was that they're actually tracing it from two different lines of King Solomon or King David.
Right, and what St. John of Damascus points out, which is what I pointed out in this article, is that in Joseph's direct line, because one of the lines splits, and
they also point out that sometimes you're talking about maybe people who are like they're like an adopted nephew, or there may have been levirate marriage going on. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say was that St. Matthew's legal lineage, basically, of St. Joseph includes somebody who was denied from the Messianic prophecy, and I pointed that out in St. Irenaeus. I'll just read from that.
I believe, yes, and Jews use that as an argument as to why Christ couldn't be Messiah.
Right, but the whole point is that what St. Irenaeus points out is that when you use the Lucan genealogy, that even though it's similar, it branches off at Melchi. Because at Melchi, and the reason why it branches off is because of the fact that Melchi is also an ancestor to Mary, and so effectively,
does the Saint Irenaeus say he was an ancestor to the Virgin?
No, Saint Irenaeus is talking about Matthew's genealogy and points out that you can't use Matthew's genealogy. That was just to point out legal descendants to David. It was not the seed of David.
Yes. Okay, so one is a legal genealogy as opposed to a strict biological genealogy.
Correct, and the biological genealogy is the one found in Luke. But the point is that also leads to the Theotokos being from the line of David, which, as I pointed out, even Celsus was attacking the Christians for, because he was basically saying, well, how come if she was of this royal lineage that she didn't know about it? Well, a lot of people, she was a commoner by then. Okay.
Well, how many people today are descended from kings and they don't even know about it?
Yeah, and there's even people in the royal house, you go 32 houses down, you got like clockmakers.
Yeah, for example, I believe there was some documentary about this guy who's like the technical. He could claim to be king of England, and he's the Duke of so and so, and he lives in Australia. But he's got this like title that legally he can call himself the Duke of so and so, but he doesn't have any. He's not like a wealthy guy. He's like lives in a regular house with 20 acres of land. Yeah, so.
And so the point is, and he probably earned it all himself. So the point is that that's a stupid argument. Because, if you're talking about the distance between King David and the Theotokos, it's like 2,500.
But again, that does not disprove the historicity of the scriptures. Right. That just says we're not understanding correctly we're misunderstanding what the actual historical account is saying. Because there's a difference between they just getting it wrong and all these errors coming up, as opposed to us misunderstanding what the text is actually saying.
Well, this is important because I think that the original post was talking about biblical inerrancy in a Protestant sense versus biblical inerrancy in a patristic sense. And in a patristic sense, you take the fullness of the tradition to fully understand what the scriptures are saying. Whereas in a Protestant sense, you make the assumption that it is true simply because it is true, even if you don't understand how. And so this is the point is there is an explanation as to the how, and therefore the scriptures are inerrant. But you know, when you take out the explanation, then it becomes a leap of faith that, to be quite honest, isn't really necessary.
We have to try to give an explanation. That is part of apologetics. You have to try to give an explanation.
And absolutely, and the fathers do give explanations.
Yes.
So I think that the argument you would hear from a Protestant on why the Bible is inerrant versus what an Orthodox would say would be.
Well, if you just say the Bible is inerrant because the Bible says it's inerrant,
the Bible never actually says it's inerrant.
Well, I mean, what happens is that St. Paul says the Old Testament is inerrant because it's all Scripture is inspired by God.
Right.
Yeah, but he wasn't technically. The New Testament hadn't entirely been written at the time, or
Yeah, many Protestants will try to say, but he obviously intended his Scripture to be Scripture.
Well, God, ultimately, I do believe God was, obviously he was being inspired by the Holy Spirit to write these things. So, in retrospect, we can look at this applied to the New Testament. Yes, that's true. And the other issue is that, remember, there were various views of inerrancy in the early church, which kind of persisted over time. Yeah. There were some people who believed that there was only one set of manuscripts that could be considered completely inerrant, and that the Holy Ghost dictated literally every single word. So the human writers had there were some people who believed the human writers had no application whatsoever. That view has not really been a prominent view in the church. The view in the church, as I understand, has always been there was a synergy between the writer and the Holy Ghost in writing the scriptures, so that he would preserve them from making doctrinal and historical errors and falsities and lies and such, because they were cooperating with the Holy Spirit. But their personality still could, like we see the personality of the Apostle Paul, for example, in his epistles. Yeah. All right. We see the personality of St. John in his epistles. All right. But that did not mean that there was no inspiration helping them compose these things. So
I'm hoping Emmanuel got a good answer. A few people got involved in that discussion, and I think
what happens is people, any of these arguments that come from modern day atheists and Enlightenment people, and a lot of them get into world orthodoxy, and hopefully not in true orthodoxy, where they basically began to so attack Protestantism that they eventually believe that, well, if you believe the Bible has no errors, that's a Protestant doctrine or something like that. And they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and they don't understand the Orthodox doctrine. You look in the Fathers on all these disputed passages, all right, where people try to bring up the inerrancy, the errors of the Scripture supposedly, and they will defend them. They will try to give a reason. Now, if the Fathers just thought, well, they made a bunch of mistakes, but the general narrative is correct, that's all that matters, and that's all they viewed, they would have just said something like that. They would have not cared to give an explanation at all. You know my point.
Now, we got a question. Okay. Are marriages seen in the same manner as baptisms? If you have the correct form, can the marriage be received via economy? For that matter, are ordinations viewed the same way?
About the concept of, let's say, now that's an interesting question, because what about cases in which they took in, let's say, all these monophilites, like remember the ecumenical patriarchate was in monophyllite heresy for essentially 50 years.
Yeah.
Okay. And then when it's reconciled, what about all the people who were baptized, not just baptized and chrismated, but married in the meantime? And they were essentially, all these were done outside the church. Yeah. Right. Now, I could be mistaken, but I don't think they went through and did mass remarriage ceremonies.
No, they didn't. That would have been a mass application of economy.
Yes, and the same thing happened at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, where the Ecumenical Patriarchate had been essentially in schism and heresy since 730. And in fact, at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, people brought this up, where they were saying, how can these people need to all be reordained? And there was decided at the council that if we did that, it would just cause more problems than just using economy and bringing them back into the church.
Yeah. So the question becomes that economy can be allowed. Now, that again is an extreme case. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Or when you're talking about thousands or even hundreds of people, or even a few dozen people.
And marriage is and to be honest, when you're dealing marriage is, to me at least, when you look at the canons about it, the novella, the laws about it, it's much more. It's a little bit more of a different issue than you're talking about receiving a baptism by economy. I think so.
Well, yeah, I would. Well, first off, because a marriage from the legal sense is repeatable anyway. Yes. So from that perspective, the church has no obligation to not repeat the marriage or to not do another marriage ceremony.
I mean, you can receive people from heresy by chrismation. I've done this, and I've given them the marriage ceremony, given them the Orthodox marriage. I've done that before, given the Orthodox marriage ceremony.
And you know, I hate to say this, but like, because here's the problem: people start asking questions like this, and this is where economy becomes a mess. People get received by economy. Let's say 2 people get chrismated into Orthodoxy, but they didn't get married properly in the church. That actually happened to me, even though it was much more complicated since I was the only Orthodox for.
Was that in Roac or in Hakan?
That was in Hakan. And the point is,
that's surprising. You think they would Hakan? Maybe it's not surprising. You think they would have done something about it? But.
Well, no, they didn't. And when I went to Gregory of Colorado, they just assumed I was married. I thought that was insane. But the point is that if you, and I'm not talking about my case, but I'm talking about a case where a couple's married and then they both become Orthodox, and it's like, well, were we previously married in the church? And the problem that people have is that you weren't anything in the church. So how could you be married in the church if you weren't in the church to begin with? So from my perspective, just do another marriage ceremony. If
all that's happening essentially is you're continuing, like the case of like St. Paul talks about the one spouse who is Orthodox, who converts to Orthodoxy, and the other spouse remains pagan.
Yeah. And
they're still married. They're still, like, to be frank, a natural law, but it's not a sacramental marriage. It's not a marriage in the church. And you don't have to leave them unless they start trying to prevent you from becoming Orthodox. That's not, But if that other spouse becomes Orthodox, all right, the question is, well, what then?
Why not just do a marriage?
Exactly. What's the objection for it?
Exactly, and it seems to me to be a very strange thing, because it's like,
I think what happens is there's a psychological issue where people begin to say, well, I guess we were fornicating for 40 years.
Well,
but that's not what we're not saying. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that
not true.
Exactly. Yeah. We're saying this is a sacramental marriage. This is the grace of matrimony coming from God in the church by the priesthood upon you. All right, and that's something that you should want.
Right.
And it's not denying that fact. It's not saying you were fornicators for 40 years because one was Orthodox and the other spouse wasn't, or you both weren't Orthodox or whatever.
Yeah. Now, in my particular case, when I left the Roman Catholic Church and I first became Orthodox, my ex did not, and but in fact, I tried to get married in the Roman Catholic Church before I became Orthodox, and they told me no. And so when I got the state certificate, I was actually banned from communion for 9 months.
Why would they not do the marriage?
Well, first off,
I don't want to get too personal. I just don't know. I don't.
The simple reality was we went to the local Latin priest. He met us for 20 minutes, and he said, "No, I'd never marry."
Oh, because he just objected to it. He didn't like it.
He just saw us fighting for 20 minutes and said,
it was like a marriage counseling type thing. All right.
Well, okay. No, it was more like a marriage preparation type thing, and it only took about 10 to 20 minutes before everything was a freaking mess on the table, and he was like, absolutely not.
Okay.
And ironically, before my ex left me, it was that 1 year I was in World Orthodoxy, and I asked an Antiochian priest the exact same thing, and the terrifying part was he said after seeing our relationship over a few months, he used the exact same words and said I would never marry.
Okay.
Anyway, so that answers the question. Look, if you're married secularly, you're not fornicating, but if you both become Orthodox, just take the blessing, or better yet, make it bigger. Get a horse. Do something interesting with it. Make your wife happier.
Get a horse.
Sometimes they have like these horses, like like
a carriage. You mean?
Yeah, horses in the back. And it's like these like white, carriage type things. And
you mean after they get married, they sit in the horse-drawn carriage?
I'm not saying that that's necessarily a thing, but the whole point is make it special if you want to make it special. But if you've been married for like 10 years and you have 2 kids and you both become Orthodox, just take a quick blessing. It's okay, unless you really want to. But the point is that.
Okay, what's another question? There's the gender identity conversion therapy issue, which we wanted to touch on.
That was a tough one. Okay, somebody came up and asked. They were doing research on conversion therapy for gender identity, and they know someone who identifies as transgender. I mean, later the person who contributed says they basically stopped talking, because they would affirm their gender change. This is a complex thing, and it's
we can't affirm their gender change.
We're not going to. We should. I wasn't doing it. But what I'm saying by that is, it's not. As this is going to sound awful. This is why we have this wonderful listener advisory thing. I mean, it's not as simple as somebody deciding to go gay or the other way, because as somebody put it when someone else was in such a relationship, and someone said, "Well, they're happy," and I said, "No, they're genitally satisfied." That's a different, and what I mean by that is that doing that sort of stuff in the demented manner has some pleasure attached to it, but that is not what this gender dysphoria is. That's actually something that's deeply been covered before the whole sexual revolution movements in the 70s and 80s destroyed the DSM.
Well, remember there were all these back in the 1920s. There were these weirdo German psychiatrists promoting transgenderism back in the 20s.
Yeah, but what I'm going to say is American psychologists before the 70s, if you look in psychology textbooks, one of the major reasons that gender dysphoria developed was based upon lack of self-esteem and was based upon parental mistreatment. So many of these cases, first off, what they don't want to usually say is that 80 to 90% of gender dysphoria cases go away once the child has reached the age of maturity. But for the other 10%, there's usually a lot more involved. There can be child abuse involved. There can be mental conditioning. I saw this thing, and it really upset me, where it's like an 11-year-old being conditioned to be a drag queen. Now that's clearly because his mother's in half the shots, and she's doing all the talking for this poor kid. They're presenting that like, oh well, you have to be tolerant. No, that's child abuse. The point is that kid, to be deciding what ice cream he wants, not like.
I mean, what? When I was growing up, I would say I wanted to be a transformer when I was 4, but should I have gotten cybernetic implants when I was 4 years old? I mean, that would have been terrible. Imagine.
You identify as an attack helicopter.
Exactly.
I get that, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as a kid going, well, maybe I'm a girl, and then the parents are like, oh well, okay. Usually there's a lot of parental conditioning involved because the parents themselves are messed up. I'm sorry to say that. I see.
Well, I told you about that case from Brazil where the two lesbians, one of them had a biological son. She had decided to leave her husband and and she got custody of the boy, and she had a lesbian lover. I guess they got some kind of lesbian marriage, so-called mockery, whatever they have down there. And then they decided that the boy should be transgender, and they ended up physically castrating him. And they later killed him. He still said he didn't want to be a girl, and so they murdered him.
Wow.
And like when people were trying to post this legitimate news story on Facebook was just taking it down left and right or banning people.
Yeah.
So I mean, you have a lot of these crazy people who do stuff like that,
Well, I just saw a comment that there's evidence that said drag queen kid is being drugged with Rofinol.
Yeah, there's that supposedly a boy who's supposedly been the big drag queen. Desmond is amazing. I think they called him.
He's 11 years old.
And there was supposedly some interview I was reading about where he talked about these certain taking Quaalude or some drugs or whatever, because it was a big joke. And there were these two men that were sitting behind him, and one of them had already been convicted for murdering his previous boyfriend and hacking him up, and then he got out of prison 10 years later on some psychological occasion. So is that the kind of person you and then the parents what kind of parents are these that are letting their
that's what I'm saying, and this is my point. These kids, all of these kids are victims. They are victims of child abusers who are unfortunately in many cases their parents, their legal guardians. I do not. And I'm sorry if I maybe I'm wrong and maybe I'm backwards. But when I see a kid with transgender issues, the first thing I think is your parents were horrible. And that might be the worst thing to say, but the truth is I don't blame those kids.
Or in some cases they had no father. I think a lot of cases too.
Well, but that doesn't. A lot of kids have no father. That doesn't make them suddenly think that they're the opposite.
Yeah, you're right. There's not. I guess so. But that's still a lack of a father and lack of a proper father are issues.
Yeah, or it could be a twisted father. Look what happened with what was a terrorist kid? The what was his name? The American Taliban guy. Didn't he like end up becoming radicalized because like
he was like the son of some guy in the ADL or something like that.
No. It was, yeah, but that guy in the ADL ended up like going off and like marrying a dude, like leaving his mom and like taking custody of him, and it just got weirder and weirder until the kid just went nuts.
Yeah, there's all kinds of degenerate stuff in that organization, and all of this stuff. Yeah. So.
The point is that the point is that when I see that, I don't blame the kids for the degeneracy. I blame the parents, and if there's any way to stop them, all you can do.
Well, again, if back in the 1950, I mean, back in like 1900, if like someone said, my child has decided they want to become a woman and the doctor's going to perform operation, they would have had like what the equivalent of Child Protective Services, the sheriff would have been out there. They would have been people would have been, there would have been, all kinds, it would have been a court issue. Would have been a
court issue, and that child would have been immediately remanded to
either to another, someone close, a family member or somebody else.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and they didn't like to step in on family issues back 100 years ago, but if you were going to do something like that, they would have.
But that's the world we live in now, where we're not just seeing marriage as not the preservation of the future. We're perverting it.
Now, to them, marriage just means some kind of life commitment among two individuals or something like that.
Did you see the thing about this?
But oftentimes it's not even for life for them. So.
There's this thing called polygamy now. I just had a laugh because apparently, like, it's literally a woman married herself in Britain, and
well, I mean, you got the guy who married his horse in Canada or something like that.
The lady who married the whale. Yeah, the world is messed up right now. Anyway.
Well, didn't Caligula marry his horse, or make his horse consul?
I heard about that.
Well, maybe I'm sorry. I think he made his horse consul of the Senate. So I guess he was a little bit saner than some of these other people.
At least he didn't try. He wasn't like, well, it's also going to be my.
This is my new wife or something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. So okay, we're defending Caligula. That's
I'm not defending. I'm just saying that
Discretion is advised.
I'm not defending him. I'm saying even the degenerate people were like that would have been like, this is great. Even the degenerate Roman emperors would have thought this stuff is insane. And they were pretty bad. And that stuff was pretty bad. So, because even in ancient Greek and Roman Greek societies where they were allowing sodomite behavior, they did not allow sodomite marriage because they were like this they would have been like marriage is for raising a family, procreation, and blah blah blah, all this other stuff. Now with the coming of the gospel. A lot of the bad detritus that was in Greco-Roman society was cleared away, and that was what Justinian was doing with Theodosius.
Yeah, I was going to say it did get pretty bad.
Yes, you're right. And there were Roman emperors beginning with Octavian and then Marcus Aurelius. There were still pagan emperors that did realize a lot of this stuff was degenerate and horrible, and they tried to legislate against it, and they had varying degrees of success. But it was only with the triumph of the gospel in the church. During the time of St. Constantine and even before that society had the necessary changes, transformations happening in it where the laws actually could be changed and enforced to reflect this, if you know what I mean.
Now, Sean writes, that's the situation with my wife and I. I was baptized the year before her. Now she's baptized. We're going to be married in Orthodoxy. I'm okay with saying we've been fornicating for 25 years. I would say under natural law, you probably weren't fornicating, but however spicy you want to describe it, that's great. But more importantly, make sure that you enjoy your marital, service. Make it big. Get a cake or something. In any case, unless you've been about 25 years. I mean, you don't really need a cake. Well, you probably do need a silver ring though, or is it a gold ring?
It could be either.
I forget. Anyway. The point is,
so the concept is that we do not accept this whole transgender stuff, and a lot of this comes from parental abuse by school counselors.
Yeah,
I know a personal case where a school counselor, and then the school counselor combined with there was a divorce that happened, and then the children were taken by custody of the mother. The father was like, the court was really horrible. The father couldn't even see them all those times. The mother poisoned the children really badly. The school counselor and then the friends of the mother was like these weirdo lesbians, and they were like telling the girl who she should become transgender, and it was just this. And then the girl later tried to commit suicide. It was, I mean, they took no responsibility. They thought, well, this is just because the patriarchal society won't allow it to happen. Oh well, they did do the injections.
Yeah,
these injections made her crazier, made it even worse. You know, but I think with a lot of those people promoting this kind of global homosexual, transgender, LGBTQ stuff, whatever, they don't care how many people have to die, so they can justify this evil they're doing.
Yeah,
it's just
we have to bring that down to a local level, and when it comes right down to it, because we can talk about the the way the system is turned against Christians and how we're the bad guys, we're the renegades now. But the reality is this: the reality is when you're talking about it on the street and you see this sort of thing, that's a case of child abuse. That's what it comes down to, and that's sick and it's sad. You have for future parents, you have to protect your kids. You have to do your best.
And that means I guess oftentimes you can't, but then they have all these programs in the middle schools and in the kindergarten about teaching all kinds of obscene material, and parents complain about it, but I guess a lot of times they have no control over what's actually happening. They have to take their kids out of school sometimes.
I'm curious about one thing.
Although interestingly, and and Islam is obviously bad. When they try to do this, there was this Muslim neighborhood in England. They tried to start doing this transgender and homosexual education in kindergarten. It nearly caused a riot in this Islamic community in outer London or something like that. But that's because those parents at least were like, this is evil and we're going to complain about it. We're going to make a big deal about it. We're going to do everything we can to, not let this happen. Yeah. But I guess most people in America, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know.
All I can say
it's really far gone anyway.
There are 24 states which allow for online at-home learning.
Okay.
So there's I can include the list. I can put that right here if we want.
Do they allow it in New York State? No, they don't. No,
I'm pretty sure New York State is not allowed.
Governor Cuomo has to get his clutches in people. So.
Well, yeah, they still have the charter. That's because they're trying to destroy the charter schools altogether. And most of these online schools are charter schools. But in any case, so a link is up there. If you live in one of those 24 states, you can always pull out of the morass.
Yeah, at this point, you're not really. At this point, if you're going to a public school in all these areas, you're not really learning how to interact normally with people. You're learning.
You are not being educated. You're being indoctrinated.
Yeah, I mean, the old argument that we got to go to the local public school because you learn how to deal with people. I mean, that may have been applied 50 years ago or 60 years ago.
Yeah,
that's not the same anymore.
Themselves online now.
Exactly.
So times have changed, and we have to be ready for it. And the answers are always the same. I will say this because I didn't get a chance to before. That even though the Greco-Roman world had standards, they sunk into levels of degeneracy that we've seen.
Yes, that was during the collapse. Exactly. No, that's true. I'm not defending them.
I mean, Eusebius in his ecclesiastical history talks about a woman who ate her kid, and it horrified the soul.
Oh no, that also happened in biblical times, where during a famine, when the Assyrians were besieging Jerusalem, I believe, or Samaria. I can't remember.
Your children's messed up.
So. Well, they were starving. And what happened is one of the women said, we both agreed to eat the children, and we ate her son yesterday. I mean, we ate my son yesterday, and she won't let us eat her. She's hiding her son now, So, though that, my point was that when Roman civilization in the West was collapsing and in the East was tottering in many ways, that it was with the triumph of Orthodoxy in those areas that kept everything from just going completely, going.
It rebirthed society.
Exactly. It created enough of a renaissance in the true sense of the word, where all the good things of Roman law and Roman society could be taken and preserved and enforced, and all the bad detritus, going through a furnace, all the dross is
Isn't it ironic that we call those ages the Dark Ages, and we call the darkest age of the pre-industrial era the Renaissance?
Yeah, well, but this is the problem. That's done because of what? You had basically Renaissance people in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries who gradually became obsessed with classical pagan Rome and Greek Rome as the model of everything. And they tried to this is why St. Jerome says that he regretted more than anything how when he was younger, he intensely studied and memorized all the Greek and Latin pagan literature and poems and things. And he says he realizes that later this was He says some of this could be used for education, but a lot of it was just trash. It was like the poems of Terence, or who was the other one that was like wrote all these obscene bawdy poetry, which they try to make you translate in Latin schools sometimes.
That's how I feel a lot. That's how I feel a lot about the music I listened to when I was in college.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just stupid, and I don't know. I mean, Saint Basil said you take. It's like a bee. You take the good and you leave the bad. So
now there was a comment. There's a difference between a natural marriage and a sacramental one. There absolutely is. That's correct. And
yeah, because that's how Saint Paul. That's the premise behind Saint Paul talking about how when one spouse converts, if you have two pagans, like in the First or Second Corinthians, you have two pagans and they're married in their own pagan ceremony, and then one of them is baptized, but the other remains a pagan. Saint Paul does not say you got to leave this guy because you're fornicating with him, because he would have said that if they was fornication. All right, but he says that you remain there, and in marriage is that it's acceptable to remain with the man. It's a form of a marriage, unless he tries to force you not to go to church, not to practice your religion, and then you can leave him and marry in the church without prejudice. All right, so that would be what we would consider like a natural marriage. That would have been like the marriage among, I guess, the pagans and things like that. Obviously, otherwise you'd have to argue that St. Paul and the apostles were allowing fornication to transpire in the church, which, if you read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, they definitely weren't, because they would have been excommunicating these people. So,
well, in any case, we have hit 10:30. So once again, we'd like to thank everyone for listening. Hopefully, we're able to answer questions, answer concerns, and in some way, shape, or form helpful. As always, we'll be back. I guess we'll be back next week. We will eventually get back to a 2-day schedule. But
I would like to make one comment real quick, Father Joseph, about something on the war zone. Someone asked about a letter of Pope St. Boniface to the Archbishop of Thessalonica, St. Rufus, where they only give one quote, but the quote says, "For it has never been allowed to discuss again what has once been decided by the Apostolic See," and I think you remember that comment.
Yeah.
The problem with trying to interpret this as universal immediate papal, like Vatican I, Pastor Eternus, is that if two bishops have a dispute in a synod and they take it to the patriarch as a mediator, and then he makes a decision, whether it's the patriarch of Rome or Constantinople or Antioch, if the decision is in accordance with Orthodox dogma and canons, then the decision has been made. All right. And in fact, if you look in the canons of Carthage, it says that if a mediator is chosen in a dispute between clergy or laity with their bishop, or a clergy with their bishop, and the mediators make the decision, then even if you agree that they're the mediators, then that decision stands. All right. So, especially since Thessalonica and Illyria, Greece, Macedonia, these areas were technically within the Patriarchate of Rome. So if they're appealing to the patriarch, their own patriarch, about a bunch of issues, and they lay it before him and say, "We want you and your bishops in a
it doesn't prove anything. It's just typical Orthodox.
Exactly. It is exactly. Yes. And remember how he calls Rome the Apostolic See, but remember how we quoted something previously, how St. Theodoret Cyrus calls Antioch the Apostolic See.
And there's nothing wrong with calling something an Apostolic See. It doesn't necessarily mean that means you can develop a monarchy out of it.
Exactly.
But in any case.
Anyway.
All right. So I think have we covered everything? I think.
I think so. I think we have.
I think so. And
we recently had Pentecost, so that was a glorious feast. And
we're in the Pentecost.
Next week we'll begin. Next week we begin the Apostles' Fast.
So we'll sound a lot angrier. No, I'm just kidding.
No,
only I will. The point is that in any case,
let's make plenty of peanut butter sandwiches. So.
Yeah, that's the thing. Peanut butter sandwich. It's weird how many people have said it. What about peanut butter sandwiches? Yeah, of course you can have peanut butter sandwiches. I just don't like peanut butter sandwiches.
Oh, well, you can buy that beyond. Anyway,
I'll buy a fake egg. I'll buy more fake eggs. Only if they sell it for 79 cents, and I'll just make fake eggs, omelets, and things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I guess we've into the program. Okay, so
good night, everyone. Thank you for listening, as always. And Father Enoch, benedicite.
Benedicite.